Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all this week. We are having spring-like weather. Thankfully, winter was put off for another week at least, so I'm enjoying the decreased energy bill, that's for sure. So today I plan to continue in this two-part series on the history and the origins of Christmas. We started last week. In my sermonette in part one, we covered what Christmas was like during the colonial era in the United States and what many of the religious figures of the time said about the celebration of Christmas. And what we learned that was by and large, Christmas was not celebrated in the colonial era. That's what we learned about Christmas in the colonial era. In fact, it was rejected and it was preached against by many of the popular Protestant, Puritan, and Quaker preachers of the day. So today, I plan to trace the Christmas ideas, practices, and origins back to, if we can, what we call, maybe the original Christmas. What is the original Christmas anyway? Where does that come from? And spoiler alert, it doesn't begin at the birth of Christ. It's not where it starts. So last time we learned that Christmas was not even a federal holiday until 1870. So this is a very recent thing even in the United States that it is popularly celebrated. But it was most roundly rejected until, or it should say up into the mid-1800s. A lot of people rejected it in America. So we're going to trace this as a thread, if I could, and we're going to move back, and I'm going to try and connect the dots, because you can almost trace this right back to the original source, and we're going to try and do that. So we're going to go back in time. We've already talked about some of the earlier things. Let's look at this particular ad. This is an interesting ad that Coca-Cola had. This is a Coca-Cola ad that was commissioned by Michigan-born illustrator Haddon Sundblom to develop advertising images using Santa Claus, showing Santa himself, not a man that was dressed as Santa, which she had seen before, but what they believed Santa Claus himself would have looked like in 1931. So Coca-Cola helped to create this modern-day image of Santa. This is really what people think of when they think of Santa Claus. In fact, the way this is, what people, in their image, in their head, this is the way they look at him. They were trying to figure out how culture would accept him, and they wanted to present him as this sort of a plump, very jovial, friendly-looking person, this very happy person with a white beard. So what we might call the original Santa Claus was not like this, and he didn't look like this. He was made more and more friendly over the years, and you're going to see that. This is a continuation back in this line as we trace back through history. So prior to the Coca-Cola Santa Claus, Thomas Nast drew a Santa Claus, which is considered the principal agent which created the visual image of Santa Claus. So notice in this picture from 1881 that he is holding a watch. I want you to notice a few things in here. He has a sword and he has a doll, of course represents the child. And these are all part of a theme that you will see as we go back in time in images that are associated with what we would call Santa Claus. And I won't be able to show you all of them because there are quite a few of them, but I'll try to tell you about some of them and places where to look as we move back and we go along in time. But keep your eyes open, if you would, for them. These same thematic items are in other pictures. You'll notice them. The clock, especially, the child, and the sword. You'll notice things like that. So in the 1840s and the 1850s, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert popularized a new way of celebrating Christmas. An engraving of the royal family celebrating Christmas at Windsor was published in 1848. Prince Albert was German, and when he married his first cousin, Queen Victoria, he brought over these German traditions that were basically adopted worldwide. So, once you see a ruler do something, typically in that nation, you tend to follow along in that same pattern and practice. Modern day example would be, for instance, if you polled people before then President Obama said gay marriage is okay, most people disagreed. And they said it wasn't. But after he came out and said it was okay, then all of a sudden the polls flipped and said, most people agreed that gay marriage was okay. We see the same thing today happening with transgenderism and other moral evils as it's become more popular and accepted as your leaders start to accept those things too. Now, I recognize that there is at least one source that suggests that these practices became commonplace contemporaneously between England and Germany. They say, well, Prince Albert didn't bring this over, this is a myth. Um, um, but there is typically influence from somewhere, and we know it wasn't from England to Germany. We know that for sure. And Catherine Jones is an assistant curator of decorative arts at the Royal Collection. And she said that Prince Albert was instrumental in bringing German traditions to Britain, such as the Christmas tree. So going back to this picture for a moment by Thomas Nast, we learned was based on Clement Moore's poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas. Now, we may not be familiar with that poem, but if I said "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," you'd be familiar with that. Those were the first words of that poem, so it's become known as the poem of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" that was published in 1823. So that poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," was largely influenced by Washington Irving's book, Knickerbocker's History of New York, where he basically told the story of Odin, who was a Norse god. And he made it into this Santa Claus story, a nice little story for America. New York didn't have much of a history written down at that time, so he went about to make one up. And in 1809, Washington Irving wrote Knickerbocker's History of New York. And it was a historical satire, not a true history, but it was attempting to give New York this rich history in satirical form. And it gave America a new version of Santa Claus from the Norse god. And he took elements from the Dutch Sinterklaas, from Odin and England's Father Christmas for his creation of Santa Claus. So there was several things that he brought into the picture to make Santa Claus. So here we come to a 19th century rendition of Father Christmas, which was partly responsible for bringing this modern day Santa Claus to light. Notice this Father Christmas has holly on his head. We see that today in Christmas celebrations. Father Christmas and Father Time are really the same part of each other that have been separated over time. And there was a holly god, and some of these things were melded together. So here you can see Father Christmas on the left, and you see Father Time on the right, and you see some of the same symbology there. Notice the comparison of the two, and again, the scythe. You see the scythe, the watch. You see and the child, as we saw, or the clock. You see the big clock there. We saw these same thematic elements with Thomas Nast's Santa as well. And you'll see these elements again as we move backwards in time. You might not see a child. It might be a baby, or it might be a doll, or something of that nature. If you don't see a watch or a clock, you'll see an hourglass. If it's not a scythe, it will be a sickle, or it'll be a sword. It'll be some representation. So where you can see the children that are coming up. Baby New Year, right? Baby New Year is coming up. And basically, each one of them has a year associated with them. You can actually see that. Each 1889 for the one that's right in front, 1890 for the one behind, 1891, and so on. It goes back and back and back. And as they pass Father Time, they are sacrificed in the year, and they move into death. And that's why they're covered in this black shroud as they walk away into the mist, into the distance. Father Christmas in England had a helper, and that helper's name was Black Pete. He was also the helper of the Sinterklaas, which obviously you can gather the Santa Claus would be the same thing. There are many different types of pictures representing Black Pete. But this particular picture, like so many of them, show Black Pete carrying a burlap sack over his shoulder. And inside the sack, you often see a head of a very distraught child being taken away. These were the naughty children, the bad children that he would come to take away. And so he was the assistant of Father Christmas, and he was to assist in other ways as well. One of the ideas was that he was the devil, and he was captured to do the bidding of the Sinterklaas. He was used for that purpose. Now, the cognate of him in Germany was Knecht Ruprecht. These are all the same, just in different names in different cultures. And these are things that most people don't know about today. even though we're only, I don't know, what are we at now, 150 years or so removed from this historical era. And frankly, people wouldn't want to know about this, I think, for the most part, because it would ruin their idea of what Christmas should be like. But notice how the child is being grabbed. You can see that there by Neck Ruprecht. And the little girl is scurrying away. And the other child is turning its head, it looks like a little boy, into his mother. This is a very fearful situation with a visit from Neck Ruprecht and the Sinterklaas. You can see the Sinterklaas in the back with his cross on his popish head there, the symbol of Dagon, and he's got the staff in his hand. You would think it would be a joyful thing, but it's not. It's a very fearful thing to see them come into the house, because if you were a child and you didn't really know if you were going to get a piece of, an apple, it would be a treat you would be given at the time, a piece of fruit or something special, or if you were going to get a bundle of switches, which you can see hanging off of the back of the Neck Ruprecht there, or if you were going to get a lump of coal, or if you were going to get beat by that coal or something else, or if you were going to be placed in the burlap sack and you were going to be taken away from your family. Interesting thing here is, notice the expressions on the face of the parents. It's very interesting. Neither the mother nor the father look terribly concerned. Maybe you could make a case for the mother, although it's difficult to see that. They're not concerned for the safety of their children. Nobody is rushing to grab the child that's being grabbed by Neck Ruprecht. The father is simply smoking a pipe and really doesn't seem to be concerned at all. This is interesting because we're going to come back to this later, this particular image that you might have of the way the parents reacted here. This is one from 1863, and again, notice the children cowering in the corner from Neck Ruprecht, which is climbing through the window. It almost looks as though the mothers are pointing at the children with little concern on their faces. Maybe you could make a case that they could be holding them back. I haven't done enough research on this, but the expressions on their faces when they drew this wasn't of any big concern. It doesn't look like to me. I don't see any women in the scrum there trying to protect them. It's an interesting picture that we'll come back to again later, that idea. So in this picture, you can see the child holding a bundle of switches with which he will be punished. So he doesn't look too happy as he's looking at that bundle of switches that was given to him from Neck Ruprecht. But at least you could say, well, he wasn't hauled away in a burlap sack by Black Pete. At least he had that. But this doesn't look like a happy situation. This is the Christmases of long, long ago. On the left here, we see a picture of Krampus. Krampus is Black Pete again, by another name in a different country. And you see the tongue sticking out, which is sort of symbolical of the devil. You also see horns on Krampus, again, the symbology of the devil. This goes back to the idea that these guys were taken captive by the Sinterklaas and, used to do their bidding. So in the background, again, you'll see the Sinterklaas and then the Black Pete in the background, or Krampus in the front. You see the Sinterklaas giving apples to the children. But Krampus, the devil, he's putting one of the children, the bad kids, in the burlap sack. And he's going to be taken off to hell to be sacrificed, to do whatever it is that they would do with the child. You see in the picture on the right is Black Pete, but it looks like the Sinterklaas is actually helping him out here. Black Pete was said to listen often at the chimneys of the houses to determine which children were good or bad. That was part of his job. Carl Meissen believes that Black Pete represents an enslaved devil forced to assist his captor, and the fire-scorched devil later emerged as a black human. A devil as a helper of the saint can still be found in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovak, Polish traditions. These are Polish St. Nicholas traditions. They can find them in all of these different nationalities. Originally, St. Nicholas himself was quite stern and terrifying to children as he would punish them severely. But the addition of Black Pete took that harsh side away from him, and it softened him up a little bit. And so that Black Pete, or Krampus, or Neck Ruprecht, became the boogeyman that took all the bad children off into the burlap sack, or he'd leave coal or switches instead of gifts. Here's a 1910 photo of St. Nicholas in a procession with Krampus right behind him and the Grim Reaper at the end. All of these together, all these symbols are tied together here in this particular picture. Krampus is in chains being led by St. Nicholas, which goes back to the idea that he brought the devil to do his bidding. Like I mentioned before, Krampus is a contemporary to Black Pete in other cultures, yet he's, I think, more likely harsh. Krampus is this horned half-goat, half-demon who during Christmas would punish children who had misbehaved. He would carry birch branches with which he occasionally swats children, and in some instances the birch branches are replaced with a whip. Sometimes Krampus appears with a sack or a basket strapped to his back to cart off evil children for drowning or eating or transport to hell. Some of the older versions make mention of naughty children being put into the bag and taken away, which we've already seen. Here's a greeting card from 1900, a real greeting card. Gruß von Krampus, which means greetings from Krampus. I guess the girl was good, the boy was bad. She got apples, and the boy gets taken away in the burlap sack. Let's take a large step backward now in time. Even though it's a large step in many years, we can still put the time frames together as far as the elements. Father Christmas had waxed and waned in England since the 1200s, so he'd been around quite a while. And Christmas replaced the term Yule from Norse mythology. Today people are familiar with the term Yule still, even though it's an old term. The Yule fire, for instance, they're familiar with that. The Yule log, very familiar with that. It's still in our vocabulary, even 1,000 years later. People know at least some semblance of what you're talking about when you say Yule log. So this terminology goes back 800 to 1,000 years. So without even knowing it, people speak historical terms from so long ago that is tied to those Christmases, if you want to call it that, from way, way back. But Christianity didn't take over in the Scandinavian countries until around 1100 AD. So this predates that. So and this picture right here equates Yule with Santa. There aren't really any pictures of what Yule was or what Yule looked like, because for the most part, Yule was a log. It was just a picture of a log. And why would you have a picture of a log? Actually, I will show you one, but this wasn't. So you transfer this log into an individual, a person, a human, to make it more real. Let's go back to an earlier Christmas time. Again, the Christmases that we hear about in the songs of long, long ago, and observe how it was celebrated in Scandinavia. Now, most scholars agree that many of the current Christmas traditions can be traced back to the northern Germanic tribes of Scandinavia. There's no doubt about that. There's no question about that for sure. Yule time in Scandinavia was called a magical time. Residents would go into the forest, and they would cut down a huge tree, and they would fashion it into a phallic symbol, an idol of worship. And they would burn it for 12 days, and they would offer sacrifices to it in the form of animal or human. Now, parts of that we're familiar with in Jeremiah chapter 10, which we aren't going to cover. We see that a workman goes in the forest, cuts down a tree, brings it in the house, decks it with silver and gold. Definitely talking about what they're doing here. But we know that fire symbolizes heat, light, and life-giving properties of the returning sun. And so they would put the log in the fire and they would burn it for 12 days, and that's where you get the 12 days of Christmas. Now, the returning of the sun was very important for most societies. Most societies at that time were agrarian. They relied on the crops that came from the field. They depended on the vegetation and anything that grew in the field. And for that to grow, you need sun, you need warmth. And if there's one thing the ancients know they needed, and it was the sun. It was the warmth from the sun. And so the warmth for their houses, the sun for warming the fields, the crops, so they could survive from year to year. And their lives depended on having good crops so that they could live from year to year. There was no grocery stores or large mega farms and hardly any division of labor. And this is the same thing really when we look at the Baal cycle. If you're familiar with the Baal cycle, in this case, what would happen, even with Yule, a god would die, right, and go down to death, and then he would be resurrected and bring back life with him. It's the same cycle that you see in these pagan gods over and over again. Hollander writes about Yuletime in his History of the Kings of Norway. He says this: "It was ancient custom that when sacrifice was to be made, all farmers were to come to the heathen temple and bring along with them the food they needed while the feast lasted. At this feast, all were to take part of the drinking of ale. Also, all kinds of livestock were killed, and in connection with it, horses also, and all the blood from them was called hlot, which is a sacrificial blood, and hlotbole, the vessel holding the blood was hlotbole, and if I can say this right, hlotiner, the sacrificial twigs, or the aspergills. These were fashioned like sprinklers, and with them were to be smeared all over the blood the pedestals of the idols and also the walls of the temple within and without." You know, I wonder if this is where the idea of the bundles of switches came from, these bundles of aspergills. He goes on to say, "And likewise the men present were to be sprinkled with blood, but the meat of the animals was to be boiled and served as food at the banquet. Fires were to be lighted in the middle of the temple floor, kettles hung over them, and the sacrificial beaker was to be borne around the fire, and he who made the feast and was chieftain was to bless the beaker as well as the sacrificial meat." As in Iron Age religion in general, an important part of Germanic paganism was animal sacrifice. So Adam of Bremen stated that at the temple of Uppsala in Sweden, the sacrifice is like this: "Of all the living beings that are made, 9 head are offered, by whose blood it is the custom to appease the gods. Their bodies, however, are hung in a grove which is beside the temple." That kind of harkens back to when Israel would put groves of trees next to the temple on the altar. And God said, don't do that. That shouldn't be so. And so the grove, I think he goes on to say, is so sacred to the heathen that the individual trees in it are believed to be holy because of the death or putrefaction of the sacrificial victims. That's the decaying dead flesh. There, even dogs and horses dangle beside people, their bodies hanging jumbled together. That was your Christmas back in Scandinavian times. Yes, the participants were wild and delirious in their reveling. They worshipped the god Yule, the chief god of fire, the sun god, at the winter solstice. This celebration ran from December 25th to January 6th. We call it Christmas time, or the 12 days of Christmas. Scholars have connected this Yuletime period to the wild hunt, or this ghostly procession in the winter sky. So here we have the god Odin, also known as Woden in some literature, who would lead the wild hunt for the Yule goat or the Yule boar. And this is reflected today in the traditional Christmas ham and Christmas carols according to the Dictionary of Northern Mythology. I want you to notice in this particular picture of Odin's hunt the 2 ravens that are at the bottom of the picture. You see those down there? We'll come back to ravens later, but we already talked about this before. Ravens are symbolic of in many things in mythology, but just pay attention to those for now. In the Middle Ages, people would place a candle in their window during the 12 days of Christmas to let everyone know that they were worshiping the pagan idol of Yule. So they let everybody know, there's a light in our window, that's what we're doing. This is where the decorating of houses with Christmas lights have come from. Here is, again, the Norse god Odin, a picture here, a drawing that had many names. Of course, he had many names. One of them was Yulner, meaning Yule figure, and Longbearer, which means long beard. He was also known as Yule Father and the Yule One. You see every single ideology or idea in Santa Claus here? It's all here. Odin was an old white-bearded man bearing a sword who rode through the night sky on his eight-legged gray horse named Sleipnir. This was where the origin of the 8 reindeer of Santa's sleigh came from. But you might say, wait, there's 9 reindeer. I'm not going to name them off, but there are 9 now. Where does that come from? Well, there weren't 9 originally. Originally, there were 8. In the poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," going back to that again, the names of the reindeer were originally debuted. This is where we first learned the names. But Rudolph was not on that list. They only had 8. And it wasn't until 1939 when a news story was made and Rudolph was added to the mix, bringing the total to 9. But Odin and Sleipnir, we're told, could cover great distances in very short periods of time, just like Santa and his reindeer can cover the whole earth in a day. Almost all scholars agree that Odin was the forerunner of the Sinterklaas. According to some traditions, children would fill their boots with carrots, straw, and sugar, and place them near the chimney for Odin's flying horse to eat while resting. Odin would then return the favor and reward these children for their kindness by leaving gifts, toys, and candies in the boots. These were, again, the Christmases of long, long ago, in the Norse culture in particular, in the pre-Christian era. In fact, brethren, the Christmas celebrations that we're familiar with today have many roots in pagan festivals and festivities in many different cultures around the world in different ages, and many of them are not pretty. Rather, they are quite wicked and evil, as we've seen some of them. In De Temporum Rationale in the 8th century, the monk Bede writes about the pagan Anglo-Saxons and their celebrations of Yule. This is a modern-day translation, and it reads this. Began the year on the 8th of Calends of January. Now, the 8th of Calends of January is December 25th. That's what that means. When we celebrate the birth of the Lord, that very night, which we hold so sacred, they used to call by the heathen word Madronecht, which is Mother's Night, because we suspect of the ceremonies they enacted all that night. They would hold a sacrifice at that time. According to Thor Ewing in 2008 in his book Gods and Worshippers in the Viking and Germanic World, we learn this. In the early Germanic tribes of the Norse countries, human sacrifice was practiced. Tacitus recorded that the early Germanic tribes in the 1st century practiced public human sacrifices in a grove hallowed by auguries of the Father, amongst a bunch of trees. The practice of human sacrifice often is associated with sacred groves or trees and would continue among the Germanic peoples to the eve of Christianity. Ibn Fadlan famously described the sacrifice of a female slave as part of a Viking ship burial that he witnessed in 922. In Iceland, the medieval author of I don't even know how to pronounce this, of this book, this work, describes a human sacrifice that had allegedly been performed in the 9th or the 10th century. So we do have documentation of these human sacrifices happening. The coming of the Christian religion did not dissuade the pagans from continuing in their pagan practices. Eventually, the sacrifices were stopped, but all the other practices were continued in various forms as we've seen them down through the ages to what we see today, and they are simply a wolf in sheep's clothing, just covered up. So think about it. The Sinterklaas rides the rooftops on, with his white horse, his 8-legged white horse, right? Which has various names. Odin rides the sky with his gray horse. I should say Sinterklaas has something different that rides, but here we have Odin rides with his gray horse Sleipnir. The Sinterklaas would give chocolate letters to children. That's what he would do. Odin would give rune letters, which is their alphabet, to men. Sinterklaas carries a staff and has mischievous helpers with black faces who listen at chimneys to find out whether children are good or bad and report to Sinterklaas. We learned that one thing that Neck Ruprecht would do, listen at chimneys. And Odin had a spear and black ravens called Hugin and Munin, who would listen at chimneys, right, and would report what happened. All the same ideas. And this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. All the same practices. Now let's go back to a further time. We can trace this back even further in time to Rome. When Constantine, the Roman emperor, around 300 AD, made Christianity the state religion, It began the eventual syncretistic blending of the pagan practices with Christianity. So as the saying goes, if you can't beat them, join them. And they couldn't beat the pagans in their practices. They wouldn't let go of them, so they had to join them. And the historical roots of pagan worship practices run deep, and they weren't going to get rid of them. So by the 7th century, Pope Gregory I had ordered Augustine of Canterbury to incorporate any and all pagan practices and customs into the expanding Roman Catholic Church. Brought them all in. And so you have a complete wholesale acceptance of pagan practices in the Catholic Church. And the church then began to put Christian names on everything the pagans were doing. But in effect, nothing was different. They were still worshiping false gods. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it still looks like a pig. So we've taken you back as far as the 8th century, so far with the Anglo-Saxons. We've gone back that far. Now we see that the Catholic Encyclopedia says this: Christmas was not among the earliest festivals of the church. This is not what I'm saying. This is what the Catholic Encyclopedia is saying. Irenaeus and Tertullian omit it from their list of feasts. These were very early so-called church fathers, and they don't list them anywhere in their writings. So where does Christmas on December 25th originate? Well, Sir James Fraser says this: the largest pagan religious cult which fostered the celebration of December 25th as a holiday was the pagan sun worship Mithraism. This winter festival was called the Nativity of the Sun. Mithraism was the fastest growing cult just prior to the year 321 AD and was the major rival of Christianity. It was this competition that was taking place. And also, it was a very Gnostic religion, by the way. And so this Gnostic religion of Mithraism and all these symbols were brought into the church, and it was progressed throughout history. Franz Cumont, perhaps the greatest scholar on Mithraism, wrote this, quoting Minix Filius: the Mithraists also observed Sun Day and kept sacred the 25th of December as the birthday of the sun. Many scholars have pointed out the sun-worshipping Mithraists, the sun-worshipping Manichaeans, and the Christians were all syncretized and reconciled when Constantine led the takeover by Christianity, even if it meant the latter's surrender of the most vital scriptural truths, especially its Hebrew roots. Get rid of them. They didn't want them. However, other sun-worshipping groups were included too because of the general importance of the popularity of Sol Invictus, the invincible sun deity. Mario Righetti, a renowned Catholic liturgist, writes this: the Church of Rome, to facilitate the acceptance of the faith by the pagan masses, found it convenient to institute the December 25th, or the 25th of December, as the feast of the temporal birth of Christ, to divert them from the pagan feast, celebrated on the same day in honor of the invincible sun Mithras. Sir James Fraser wrote, if the Mithraic mysteries were indeed a satanic copy of the divine original, we are driven to conclude that Christianity took a leaf out of the devil's Bible when it fixed the birth of the Savior on the 25th of December. For there can be no doubt that the day in question was celebrated as the birthday of the Son by the heathen before the church transferred to the Nativity. That's what he said. So the mixing of pagan sun worship and Christianity is exemplified by the testimony of a Syrian scholar on Barsalibi, who said this: it was a custom of the heathen to celebrate on the same 25th of December the birthday of the sun, at which they kindled lights in token of festivity. They wanted to stir up the power of the sun with the lights to give it a rebirth and bring it back. In S.E. Titcomb, The Aryan Sun Myths, The Origins of Religions, we find it cited, quoted from many primary sources, from the primary source, that the following sun deities were all born on December 25th, according to their legends. So all these deities. We have Krishna, or Vishnu. We have Mithra. We have Osiris, Horus, Hercules, Dionysus, which is Bacchus, Tammuz, Indra, and Buddha, all born on December 25th, all around the world. Therein we also read of the Scandinavian goddess Frigga, in whose honor of Mother Night festival was held at the winter solstice on December 25th, as well as a similar great feast of Yule, where a boar was offered at the winter solstice in honor of Frey. So the winter solstice is the reason for the season. That's it. The birthday of the sun god, as it comes out on its shortest day of the year at that time and begins to grow again. But that's not the end of it, because all of these religions are attached to one another, and we need to keep moving back to the fountainhead and to the root. You know, it's kind of like that telephone game where you start out with one thing and the original thing is correct, and then you move around the room and it sort of slowly diverges from whatever the original was. And when you get to the end, it's very similar, but not quite the same. It's just off a little bit. That's the way these kind of things are as they move throughout history, these celebrations. So in ancient Rome, the winter solstice festival, Saturnalia, began on December 17th, and it lasted for 7 days. Saturnalia was the most popular holiday on the ancient Roman calendar, derived from older farming-related rituals of midwinter and the winter solstice, especially the practice of offering gifts or sacrifices to the gods during the winter sowing season. The pagan celebration of Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture and time, wow, here we have time again in agriculture, symbolizing the scythe, cutting down the crops, began as a single day. Saturnalia banquets were held from as far back as 217 BC, but by the late Republic, around 133 to 31 BC, it had expanded to a week-long festival beginning on December 17th. On the Julian calendar, which the Romans used at the time, the winter solstice fell on December 25th. The solstice has shifted over time, and today I think it's around the 21st of December, but that's because of the habits of the planets. But the celebration date of December 25th has not changed. The Saturnalia festival was held in honor of Saturn, the father of the gods, and was characterized by the suspension of discipline and reversal of the usual order. Grudges and quarrels were forgotten while businesses, courts, and schools were closed. We see that same thing today. Let's all come together for the Christmas time. Let's put everything aside. You know, even they stopped war. I think in World War II, they stopped on Christmas Day so they could come together. Wars were interrupted, postponed at that time. Slaves were served by their masters. Masquerades often occurred at this time. It was traditional to offer gifts of imitation fruit, which was a symbol of fertility. Dolls were given, which was a symbol of human sacrifice. And candles, which were reminiscent of the bonfires, which we know are bone fires, traditionally associated with pagan solstice celebrations, where the fat from the sacrifices would be used to make the candles. A mock king was chosen, usually from a group of slaves or criminals, and although he was permitted to behave in an unrestrained manner for 7 days of the festival, he was usually killed at the end. The Saturnalia eventually degenerated into a week-long spree of debauchery and crime, giving rise to the modern use of the term Saturnalia, meaning period of unrestrained license and revelry. So if you say Saturnalia, that was what the meaning became, just unrestrained licentiousness. On the last day of the Saturnalia celebrations, known as the Sigirala, many Romans gave their friends and loved ones a small terracotta figurines known as a signalia, which referred back to older celebrations involving human sacrifices. The Saturnalia was by far the jolliest Roman holiday, and the Roman poet Catullus famously described it as the best of times. It was the best of times, he said. So riotous were the festivities that the Roman author Pliny reported building a soundproof room so that he could work during the raucous celebrations. Notice on Saturn here, the scythe. Right, agriculture, but there's other things too. But sacrificing as well, we'll see. The same as Father Time, the same as Christmas time, almost looks the same, in fact, when you look at it. And also you'll see the hourglass he's holding, right? The same as the watch, the clock on Father Time. Notice also the wings. Now, you don't always see this on Saturn. You don't always see the wings, but I want you to take notice. Here we do have wings because we're going to see this later on Saturn as well. The Saturnalia underwent a major reform in 217 BC after the Battle of Lake Trasimene, when the Romans suffered one of their most crushing defeats by Carthage during the Second Punic Wars. Until that time, they had celebrated the holiday according to the Roman custom, and it was a custom that the Romans did. But it was after a consultation of the Sibylline books. The Sibylline books were very important because they were the official way of telling you how to behave or do certain sacrifices in society. I guess it would be, if we can compare it to, Josiah consulting the books and saying, wait a second, we're not doing this right, we're doing something wrong, let's do something different. So they were a way to try and get back to what they believed was the original way of celebrating the Saturnalia. And so after they were defeated in the Second Punic Wars, they got out these books and they adopted the Greek rite from these books, introducing sacrifices carried out in the Greek manner, the public banquet, and the continual shouts of, the Saturnalia, the Saturnalia, what they would shout out at banquets, and that became characteristic of the celebration. Cato the Elder, in around 234 BC, remembered a time before the so-called Greek elements had been added to the Roman Saturnalia. So he remembered this and he wrote this down. Here we have Saturn with a baby and a scythe depicting a human sacrifice. This is the first time we've actually seen a baby in the picture with Saturn ready to sacrifice that baby. Notice again here in this picture, sickle and the baby being carried away, similar to Krampus carrying away children. We also see the image of the goat in the picture, like we saw Krampus pictured as a half goat, half demon. In the background, we see a person pouring something out of a jar. And I believe this is a symbol of a libation sacrifice, the pouring out of life, in this case, the life of the child. Here's a statue of Saturn, the Roman god, devouring his own child, which is what Cronus, the Greek god, they're the cognates, so they're similar in different cultures, did with his children. Saturn is Cronus. This is one of the main themes of Greek and Roman mythology. Cronus is the king of the Titans, and he devoured all of his children, if you remember the mythological story. And then his wife Rhea, him on the last one, and she gave him, some sources say a horse, some say a stone, that he swallowed, and he thought he was swallowing his last child, which was Hercules. It was Zeus. But he tried to swallow him, but he didn't, swallowed somebody else. Zeus was hidden secretly until he was old enough to come back, and he pulled all of his siblings out of the mouth of Saturn, brought him back. And this is where the Titans came from in mythology. So again, we see here Saturn, who is eating his own child, devouring his child, what Cronus did. Robert Palmer argued that the introduction of new rites at this time of the battle with Carthage, was in part an effort to appease Baal Hamon. Now we're moving back further. This is what he said. The Carthaginian Canaanite god who was regarded as the counterpart of the Roman Saturn and Greek Cronus. By the way, this isn't what I said. This is what historians have said. That they equate Cronus or Saturn with Baal Hamon. When historians look into the historical literature of what the Greeks saw as their counterpart, they said Baal Hamon, the Phoenician Canaanite god, was the same as Cronus, who was the same as Saturn. So we don't need to make logical leaps here. It's actually in the literature right there for us. This is the way the Greeks saw this. So here's Cronus, the Greek Saturn. He's the Greek version of the Roman Saturn. We see again the scythe, the wings, the white beard, right in the sky, like Odin, like Santa, and another image that's common in pagan mythology, snakes. Very common in pagan mythology. Here are some more pictures of Saturn, which is Cronus. Taking the baby away is reminiscent of Krampus, of Black Pete, or Neck Ruprecht, taking the baby away earlier. Saturn or Cronus bears the wings that we saw earlier as well. And we've seen that Saturn and Cronus are the same as Baal Hamon. Now let's look at Baal Hamon. Here we see Baal Hamon. In an archaeological, this is an archaeological find right here. This is an image of Baal-Hamon, who was the chief god of Carthage. This is from the 2nd century, but he goes all the way back to biblical times. In fact, his name is mentioned in the Song of Solomon. In Song of Solomon 8, verse 11, you can use this as a reference. It says, Solomon had a vineyard at Baal-Hamon. He gave over the vineyard unto keepers. Every one of the fruit thereof brought in 1,000 pieces of silver. So this is way, way back. In the time of Solomon, we see Baal-Hamon existed for a long, long time. He was a weather god considered responsible for the fertility of vegetation, which is what Saturn was, and esteemed as the king of gods, which is what Saturn was. He was depicted as a bearded older man with curling ram's horns. Now, you don't see the curling ram's horns here, but there are other depictions that do have him with that. Baal's female cult partner was Tanit, who is the same as Isis. Tanit's figure was a triangle with a circle and a half moon above it with a dot. And so Tanit is a popular symbol in certain cult movies, and you'll see the same symbology in Isis as well. The worship of Baal-Hamon flourished in the Phoenician colony of Carthage. His supremacy among the Carthaginian gods is believed to date to the 5th century BC. The Greeks themselves identified him with Cronus, and the Romans with Saturn. Greco-Roman sources report that the Carthaginians burned their children as offerings to Baal-Hamon. A particular individual at Carthage, and I can't pronounce the name, so I'm not even going to try, but this particular individual in one of his commentaries was translated by Thomas Macy Finn, and it said this: Saturn had become the champion, I guess he read this source. He said, Saturn had become the champion of African paganism as well. Indeed, as Baal-Hamon in Phoenician Carthage, he was the object of child sacrifice. Although a fertility god, Saturn Baal was nonetheless ruthless in the sacrifices he enacted. From Greek religion and culture, the Bible, and ancient Near East, it quotes this: Kronos' connection to a human sacrifice was not uncommon. It also attested for Crete in the context of the Cortes, and in Carthage, Kronos was identified with Baal-Hamon, the god to whom children were sacrificed. Sophocles already connects Kronos to human sacrifices by barbarians, and in all these cases we may assume the influence of Kronos' mythical devouring of his children. In fact, an imperial description still calls him Kronos, the child eater. Baal-Hamon, the child eater. I want you to notice what Leviticus chapter 8:21 says here. And you shall not let any of your seed pass through the fire to Moloch. This is the instructions God gave to Israel. Neither shall you profane the name of the Lord, name of your God. I am the Lord. Here is a picture of Moloch, the Canaanite god, which is Baal-Hamon, which is Baal. It's the same thing, just different name. Here's another representation of Moloch. So the name Moloch is based on the root MLK, which means king. There are a number of Canaanite gods with names based on this root, which became associated with Moloch, including the biblical Malcolm, the great king, which in the King James Version we see this written as Milcom. Rabbinical tradition depicted Moloch as a bronze statue with fire into which the victims were thrown. Archaeological excavations since the 1920s have produced inscriptions including the term MLK as associated with child sacrifice. They uncovered this particular one in Carthage, this MLK in Carthage. So it was definitely known in these cultures, Carthage worshiped Baal-Hamon, that they were doing child sacrifices. This goes all the way back to the Bible. God says, don't do this because the pagans, the heathens around you are doing this. They're sacrificing their children in the fire to Moloch. Cleitarchus has a description of the practice which predates to the fall of Carthage in 146. It says this: there stands in the midst a bronze statue of Kronos, its hands extended over a bronze brazier, the flames of which engulf the child. And when the flames fall upon the body, the limbs contract, and the open mouth seems almost to be laughing until the body and the contracted body slips quietly into the brazier. Thus, it is that the grin is known as sardonic laughter, since they die laughing. But here in this particular source, and I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, Diodorus Siculus, there was in their city a bronze image of Cronus extending its hands, palms up and sloping down toward the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereupon, rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Diodorus also relates that relatives were forbidden to weep, but when they were forbidden to weep in that Agathocles defeated Carthage, the Carthaginian nobles believed that they displeased the gods by substituting low-born children for their own children. They attempted to make amends by sacrificing 200 children of the best families at once, and in their enthusiasm actually sacrificed 300 children. Plutarch wrote in one of his books this. He said, quote, "But with full knowledge and understanding, they themselves offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mothers stood by without a tear or moan, but should she utter a single moan or let a single tear fall, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nevertheless. And the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, that the cries of wailing of people would not hear the ears of the people." You know, I think back to that picture, and this is what I want to remind you of the mother and the father sitting idly by without a care in the world when Krampus takes their children away. It reminds me of this, where they were to be silent. You know, the rabbinical commentary has a whole section on this and describes the atrocities in much more graphic detail, and it is horribly gruesome what they did. So how then do we get back further from the Canaanite gods to earlier ones? How do we move back further? Because we've made almost a line-for-line movement back from now to back in the biblical times here. Well, we've already gone back at least 1,500 years without a hiccup in the chain, and you can see that most of the worship was only minorly different. So if we use a common date now of 2348 for the flood, from the Canaanite Moloch, we're only about 800 years removed from the flood. Only about 800 years, which today's time frame is what? 1200 or 1300 AD. So we're not that far away from going back to the original source. Now, there are some hints in history to where we'll turn next. Philo's account ascribed by Eusebius to semi-legendary pre-Trojan War Phoenician historian Sanchuniathon, don't try to pronounce this, Sanchuniathon, describes, or indicates, I should say, that Cronus, which is Baal, Hammon, and Moloch, was originally a Canaanite ruler who founded Byblos and was subsequently deified. So now that's interesting, because now we go back to some history where we see where this began. We begin at something. Byblos. Byblos is identified as one of the oldest cities in the world, the beginning of civilization. Now, there's another city that's considered ancient as well, and that's Nineveh. We're told in Genesis 10:11 that Nimrod built Nineveh. And in the famous Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris, Byblos is cited as the city where Isis located the body of her dead husband in the trunk of a tree which had grown around him after his murder by his brother Set. According to Christmas Unwrapped from the History Channel by Alan Mansiger, Christmas, quote, "Christmas as a pagan holiday traces back thousands of years before to a man named Nimrod." This is what the History Channel said. "Founder of ancient pagan Babylon." There are several stories about Nimrod's origins, and they differ in some respects or aspects, but are remarkably similar in many ways in different cultures. Nimrod was said to have been the first man to offer protection for people from others and wild animals by building city walls. And of course, he is attributed by many sources as building the Tower of Babel. He is said to have introduced polytheistic worship among the people, and his mother was part of this system. His mother's name was Semiramis. In fact, she ended up marrying her son and ruling together with him. We have our own little soap opera back then. According to Josephus, he writes this, that Shem, the son of Noah, was very upset about this whole mess. And he gathered 73 co-conspirators together and killed Nimrod. He had each person take a piece of Nimrod's body and scatter it among the people as a warning. But Semiramis was now pregnant. Dun, dun, dun. And she took opportunity to say that her pregnancy was miraculous, alluding to the prophecy from Genesis 3:15, that a child would be born that would bruise the head of the serpent. And I think the symbolism exists in the serpent being subdued by Kronos in his chariot, and by the center clause being the devil, taking the devil captive. That's the same sort of symbology. But Semiramis told the people that her child was Nimrod, reborn in the form of Tammuz. So Alexander Hislop, in his book, The Two Babylons, writes this. He says, the Christmas tree, now so common among us, was equally common in pagan Rome and pagan Egypt. In Egypt, that tree was the palm tree. In Rome, it was the fir. The palm tree denoting the pagan Messiah as Baal Tamar, the fir referring to him as Baal Berith, the mother of Adonis, the sun god and great mediatorial, mediatorial divinity, was mystically said to have been changed into a tree, and when in that state to have brought forth her divine son. If the mother was a tree, the son must have been recognized as the man the branch. We've seen that in the Bible. And this entirely accounts for putting the Yule log into the fire on Christmas Eve and the appearance of the Christmas tree on the next morning. This would happen. I've never done this. We as Americans, didn't used to put Christmas trees up early. They used to come up right after Christmas Eve, and this is where it came from. You would put the Yule log in the fire, and boom, you would have a Christmas tree the next day in your room. The Yule log dies in the fire, and up springs a tree the next morning, the resurrection of the Yule log. The Christmas tree, as has been stated, was generally at Rome a different tree, even the fir, but the very same idea was implied in the palm tree, was implied in the Christmas fir, for that covertly symbolized the newborn God as Baal Berith, Lord of the covenant, and thus shadowed forth the perpetuity and everlasting nature of his power. Now that after having fallen before his enemies, he has risen triumphant over them all. Therefore, the 25th of December, the day that was observed at Rome as the day when the victorious God appeared on earth, was held as the Natalius Invicti Solis, the birthday of the unconquerable sun. Now the Yule log is the dead stock of Nimrod, deified as the sun god, but cut down by his enemies. The Christmas tree is Nimrod, the slain god comes to life again. Very similar symbology of what we see with Christ himself as they try to co-opt it and take that over. This then is where it all begins. It all begins right here. The worship of mother and child spread from Babylon to the ends of the earth, but are called different names in the languages of the various countries where their worship appeared. In Egypt, the mother and her child were worshipped as Isis, with the infant Horus being the rebirth of Osiris. Isis is Tanit, who is the consort of Baal Hamon. The ancient Norse worshipped the Yorth, or Thor, the son of Odin. In India, the mother and child were called Devaki and Krishna, and also Isi and Iswara, as they are worshipped to this day. In Asia, they're known as Cybele and Dioeus, I guess. In pagan Rome, as Fortuna and Jupiter. In Greece, as Ceres. We actually have Ceres on top of our capital here in Missouri. The Great Mother with babe at her breast, or as Irene, the goddess of peace, with the boy Plutus in her arms. Even in Tibet, China, and Japan, Jesuit missionaries were astonished when they went there to find the Roman counterpart of Madonna and Child in that culture. So much so that they didn't even have to make another image of the Madonna and Child. They just took what they had and renamed it. And they called it the Mother and Child. Here's Qingmu, the Holy Mother in China, was portrayed with the child in her arms and a glory around her, which is not here, but the glory of the sun that was over top of her head. Here we have a historical progression of the raising of the Christmas tree. On the left, we have the original Egyptian, this is about a 2800 BC version of the raising of the Djed pillar, a tree-like rendition of the backbone of the reborn Osiris, raised annually, generally on December 21st, as a tamarisk tree, an evergreen, and a few days before the December 25th winter solstice and the birth of Horus by Isis. In the middle, we have Dionysus, the Greek version of Osiris, being raised like Orion or Osiris as the reborn evergreen tree. And on the right, we have the modern Christian version of this pine tree, the Christmas tree, decorated with a star at the top. I'd like you to, well, you can just read this. I'm going to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12, we'll read verses 1 to 4. It says, "These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess all the days that you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree." These are the groves, the Asherah poles, the Christmas trees. These are what those are. You should destroy all of them. You'll tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherah poles with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of their place. And you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Gill's commentary reads, "Upon the high mountains and upon the hills, which they chose to worship on, being nearer the heavens, and which they thought most acceptable to their gods. And some of them had their names from hence, as Baal Peor, in like manner as Jupiter Olympus was called by the Greeks. And under every green tree which being shady and solitary and pleasant to the sight, they fancied their gods delighted in them, and this notion prevailed among other nations, and there is scarcely any deity but what had some tree or other devoted to it, as the oak to Jupiter, the laurel to Apollo, the ivy to Bacchus, the olive to Minerva, and the myrtle to Venus." Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 20 says this, "Indeed, long ago you threw off my authority and refused to be subject to me. You said, 'I will not serve you.' Instead, you gave yourself to other gods on every high hill and under every green tree, like a prostitute sprawls out before her lovers." That's quite an image there. As a prostitute sprawls out before her lovers, she invites all to come in. This is what the tree represents, is a prostitution and an abomination in the face of God. Here's an interesting chart that kind of puts a lot of this stuff together. You can look at this later, but you can see Jesus is not the reason for the season. You can see all these different symbols and all the pagan eras of which they came from. Osiris and son of Horus is the reason for the season. That's what is the reason for all of these things that are happening. I want to close here by looking at Revelation chapter 18. It says in Revelation chapter 18, "And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine and wrath of her fornication." All the nations have drunk. And we see the same symbols in every culture around the world. And we noted that here. "And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." You know, back in Revelation 17, it talks about this woman again, and she has a name. And on her forehead, it says in verse 17, was written a name of mystery, "Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And the woman that you saw in the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth woman you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth." Here we go back again to Babylon. We go all the way back to the original. This is where it starts. So we see history in our time as we grow up. We think about what goes on around us. The historical breadth and depth is but just a few years when we're young. How many times have you heard? Well, actually, I'll give you a perfect example. If I can pick on my son Jack here. So we get pizza on Saturday night. We've been doing this for, I don't know, maybe a year, probably not even that, consistently. And, it's become sort of a tradition to get pizza on Saturday night. So Jack wants to go with me. He doesn't want to break the tradition, which is kind of neat. Doesn't want to break the tradition, so he goes with me to get pizza on Saturday night. But when you grow up, you think we've been doing this forever. How many times you say, well, we did X number, we did this certain thing for as long as I can remember. You go back and talk to your parents, well, we did that for like 5 years. But in your mind, you see this long view, and you live in this history, and you think it's so grand and so long, but it's really not that long. But as we age, we see it more broadly and more deeply. And we know that God looks at history, however, differently. He sees everything from the outside. He sees the timeline of history. And what seems like a long time for us is but a very short time to him. And so when we look at something that happened 4,000 years ago, people say, well, that was way back then. That was so long ago. Nobody remembers any of that stuff anymore. It doesn't really matter. And we think it's so far removed, and it's so far away, and it doesn't mean anything today. But in God's mind, it means everything, because he sees all this history and everything that's led up to it. So if he sees wrong here 4,000 years ago, right, if it's just a few days to him, as 1,000 years is a day is 1,000 years, why would it be okay 4 days later, in his view? God doesn't have a short memory for the things that have gone on as a prostitution against him. He remembers it. Man sees but a sliver in time, but God sees forever. So Christmas celebrations are just as much an affront to him today as they were 4,000 years ago. So it's important that we stick to the Bible and what it says and the celebrations that the Bible gives us to worship the true God, and not the false celebrations that really point back and worship a false God.